Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with season 11, episode 20 of our weekly Q&A videos. This is the season of the Lost Challenge characters. It's the second last episode. We're covering Zatanna this week. Next week is going to be Zod Prime. I guess I've skipped sort of the part where we talk about accessing this on podcasting platforms, but whatever. We say that so often that you already know that.
And we got a lot of ground to cover today.
Yeah, so...
And I want to say it's funny, right? Because Zatanna, she is Zatanna Prime because she's not assigned to any universe, but she's the only skin. Mm-hmm. There are no other Zatannas. So do you call, if there's only the one, do we need to declare them Prime?
I don't know. It's one of those nomenclature things.
Yeah.
I think because
we'll never know.
You don't need to disambiguate, right? You don't need to determine the difference between different things that are similar or the same. So whether or not you use the right naming scheme, right? If you don't use the right naming scheme and there's multiple options, you might get it wrong. But if you use the wrong naming scheme and there's only one option, everybody always knows who you're talking about.
But the problem is we will never know. Yeah. This is one of those eternal mysteries because we will never, ever know.
I think it just doesn't really matter. And I don't mean in the, I don't care about it, but in that literally the information contained in it is equivalent no matter what.
But it is one of those mysteries that nobody really cares about. And even if you play Injustice, you probably don't. But for a small number of us who spend a lot of time with Injustice, we think about all the little tiny nuances.
Mm-hmm. So her passive is Deck of Fate, which is pick a card, any card. Each card has one of 5 effects. Regain 50% of health, damage over time, damage boost, power drain, or as in all magic, it can backfire. She's got 900 attack, 1,150 health as her base stat. She was last available on the 5th of March, 2020.
All right, so base stats, let's get the easy stuff out of the way. Base stats are, middling, which is typical of the earlier challenge characters, which she was. She was last available March the 5th, 2020. And what distinguishes her really is that she has an awful, awful special 2. And by extension, she has an awful, awful passive. Yeah. And we can talk about it in a bunch of different ways. So, one, it's too fast to pick. It feels like it's faster than the Harley Quinn, which is the Harley Quinn that has the 5 spots. I can't remember whether it was Arkham Knight or Suicide Squad. Either way, it goes even faster than that. So it's hard to get exactly what you want every time. And there is a 1 in 5 chance that you will stun yourself. Yeah. That you will, after doing your special, you will be stunned and leave yourself open so that the opponent gets a free shot at you while you're waiting patiently for that to happen. You can do nothing about it. All right, maybe I shouldn't say nothing. I mean, there's some stuff on the wiki that they talk about that I just can't get my mind wrapped around using because maybe I need to play her more. But all right, so let's look at it. Regain health is you get 50% of your health back. That's the pale blue card that's Zatanna. The damage over time is very low damage. It's only 8% of your damage stat over 3 seconds. And because her damage stat is not that high, you're not getting very much. And that's the yellow Deathstroke card. Damage boost is 50% damage boost. That's the red Wonder Woman card. You will lose the damage on tag out. So here's the problem. As your special specialist, to do the special 2 immediately, her other gears, you can't fill 3 slots to boost her basic damage. So when you boosted her her damage by 50%, you don't have any power bars typically. Mm-hmm. You got to tag her out to reload. Well, that rinses off the effect of Wonder Woman. Yeah. Because you can't just really stand there and eat it because she's just not powerful enough to do that.
Just swapping out, especially with Tantutono and Master's Death card, is such an important part of sort of the rhythm of battle. Yes. That not being able to swap out is not worth the 50% extra damage.
Right. It's just not. And so it's not as useful, or it doesn't really make much of a difference. It doesn't move the needle in the game. Power drain. I think you can get all the power of the opponent if it's unblocked. That's the blue Batman. Again, because it's hard to pick, you run the same problem if the opponent has 2 of the LexCorp gear set. And then the last one is you stun yourself. That's the green Joker. And the wiki, the Injustice Mobile wiki, says that you can negate the stun by block, but I'll be darned if I can remember to try to block it when I pick the wrong card. I'm just so frustrated at picking the card that every time I'm staying there like a dummy waiting. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very much like, who were we doing last time, where if you just don't bother waiting at all for the animation to finish, you can chain the special 2. We were talking about just recently. I think Was it who was it a couple weeks ago?
I don't remember.
I don't remember either. All right, I just remember the idea, and that sometimes it's just training yourself to do stuff that you normally don't do because you've gotten into these sort of muscle memory habits where I find my fingers moving to do certain things before I've even thought about it.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's the other. So that's one reason why Special 2 is bad. The second reason why Special 2 is bad is that there's no mini game for the damage. So it always does. There's no way to increase your damage. So it always does the stated minimum damage. So even though it shows a range, you don't ever get the top of the range. So basically, the damage is effectively halved for having that secondary effect, despite that being your passive. So almost every other character that has a special effect that's a result of their passive
does normal damage.
Does normal damage. And technically she's doing full damage because you can't do a mini game to boost the damage.
Yeah.
So she's doing so little damage that it makes her passive even worse, so that if you happen to get the red Wonder Woman card, you have to be out because you're unlikely to be knocking out the opponent and getting your power back. So, what else? I just feel like it's just so awful. It's so not useful, and I guess you could try to rely on the special one if you're going to be doing basic damage with her. But here's the kicker. Her special one is halved because it does a damage over time, a burning damage over time. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's nothing special about her basics. They do sort of the normal amount of damage, right, with this tap and swipe combos. Now, what I like about if I'm going to struggle to say something good about her, her special one shoves pretty hard, even when they block, separate from Master's Death card. So it saves her against someone, at least in this team loadout and team composition, it saves her against someone with an unranged special or any opponent that won't start a special at a distance. Mm-hmm. So, for example, say Superman, mostly I think I noticed it with Injustice 2 Superman, Arkham Knight, where because you shove them, it buys us enough time that he can't do a special, even if he's got bars of power.
Yeah. And
we've done enough so that we can tag out Zatanna and bring in Rebirth Raven to steal all the power. So that's the one thing I like. The problem is these fights are... They drag because she does so little damage. Whatever her stat is, what is it, 900? It's just not enough to make up for both her special 1 and special 2 being basically half damage. And then you just, most of the time, my inclination in a fight is with my specialist to bring them in as quickly as possible to drop a special 2 bomb. And it just isn't. It's more like a little firecracker.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what to say. Like, my first impression of her when we first got her was that she's pretty awful. And after playing with her for a week, she's still pretty awful. Mm-hmm. I just...
You didn't find much redeeming about her.
No, and the more I played, the worse it got, because I thought, a lot of times when you start playing and you get better and you feel like you're getting the hang of it, really she works as a gear shatterer because of the way we've loaded her. There's not a lot of potential to make her the main damage dealer. So essentially, most fights, Raven is doing a large part of the work by stealing power and then dropping some specials. So no thank you, Zatanna. And so you already mentioned. So this is, normally we don't have a great way of beginning and ending seasons, but this is going to be a great way to end it because we've only got one more character. And Zod is Prime because there's the Man of Steel Zod. Or is he General Zod? I can't remember. There's something about the name that's a little different.
And then we'll also maybe try to wrap up our discussion of tier listing for next week, so that's like a season finale.
Ooh.
It works out pretty consistently because this is like one of the few like multi-part episode runs we've had.
Like a story arc.
Yeah.
Because it's, what it reminds me of? It's like television shows. Probably when you were too young to be noticing or caring about it. Back in the old days, almost all television shows
were episodic, and they weren't they didn't have the longer arcs, or if they did, they weren't as important to understand. Like the goal was that you could watch them out of order, or you could miss it, and that you would essentially be able to tell on its face if something was different. You'd be able to look at it and go, "Oh, this is what's changed," and not have like no clue what was going on.
And I think the reason they used to do that was that if you had to rely too much on an overarching storyline, then people who missed an episode or 2 episodes and there wasn't streaming available and it wasn't on DVD, it was basically, I mean, again, can you imagine this? Watching TV on the day it came out, and if you missed it, you missed it, or taping it on VCR, or if you missed it, you could potentially catch up on it during the summer, but there weren't enough weeks in the summer to really necessarily get all the episodes in. So with streaming and DVDs and the ability to watch on demand when you wanted to, when you were ready to watch it, it's changed sort of the complexion, I think. There's so many more big storylines in TV shows.
Okay, something kind of funny. There's a show called Ghosts. There's both an American and a British version of it. And I really like the British version. I think the American version is all right? Like, I think the problem is always when you can compare.
Right.
And in my opinion, I watched the British one first and I like the British one a lot better. Right. So I think the American one is honestly probably a pretty good show, but it's, you know, it's like when you get a character that's nerfed, right?
Right.
So what's funny is I've had 2 mix-ups with the show. I had one person, it wasn't me, but like somebody got recommended the show. And they were recommended it by people who watched the American version.
Right.
And then they watched the British version and were like, oh, this is really good. And so they essentially watched an entirely different show. Right. And the other thing is that when I watched it, I actually watched it out of order. The seasons were mislabeled for me.
Yeah.
And I watched season 2 first, and then season 1. And so I thought it was great. I really enjoyed it. Season 2 works totally fine as a jumping in place. And then season 1, I was like, oh, it's a flashback episode. The first episode of the flashback, they show you how they got that way.
That's great.
And I was like, that's cool. And then I was like, oh, now we're getting all the backstories of the characters. That's cool. Then they're giving less like time for every backstory and whatever. And so I just thought that it was this funny, cute show. And then in the second season, I was like, oh, they're going to do the whole season in the past. That's a bold choice. But it was just fun and nice. And so I liked it. So it's you know, not exactly episodic because there is development, but it's kind of episodic in the fact that it works when they just dump you in the middle of it. So I even had a different experience. There's people who, you know, got recommended by an American viewer and watched the British version. Yeah. And then there's me who watched season 2 and then thought that season 1 was the second season where they went back and explained everything to you. And I thought it really worked, and also it was a great flow for it. And so there's something extra funny about, you know, it's a good show, and it's well executed to the point that I was essentially watching it in memento order, right?
All right. Memento was fun.
Yeah.
I don't know if it would work in a linear fashion. So I've seen people, there's
Edit
some way
together,
or some way that you can watch it. Can you do it on
special
DVD?
Features or something, whatever, yeah.
You watch it in a linear fashion, yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, the first comment talking about tier lists this week comes from Methuselah Honeysuckle 4813, and they say, super fun discussion. I don't have much time to play, and so I usually just play my best teams to accomplish whatever goal I'm working on. This means that I often have misinformed opinions about different characters. One example of this is Rebirth Raven. I actually did not like that character until I heard you guys extolling her virtues. I then decided to give her a second chance, and now she's in my standard multiplayer team. I really enjoy hearing this kind of discussion and multiple people's perspectives. And so I don't think we have too much to say about this.
I do have one comment I want to make, and I'm just wondering, so how much of it is... So a lot of times I feel like when I'm reading the Reddit, the Injustice Mobile subreddit, and I see opinions about stuff, and I completely disagree. And then we go on our channel and say a bunch of stuff saying, not necessarily that we disagree directly with those opinions, but just that we lay out our opinion.
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes that opinion ends up going mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
The example of that is Hawkgirl being S tier.
Yeah. Your sentiment analysis was that people didn't care that much for her, and we seem to be some of the earlier people who were championing her.
Yeah, so I'm curious about how mainstream it gets, because this is clearly an example of somebody who...
And we say mainstream, relatively speaking.
Well, I mean, if you're talking mainstream, I mean, none of us playing Injustice are really mainstream. I mean, I think Injustice 2 might be more popular. I just can't stand that game.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's neat that I see an example where we actually have the influence. In my mind, I'm just a little curious whether we actually have any kind of influence like that at all, because, you know, who else is now S tier? Or that I see an S tier, like Batgirl, I see an S tier now.
Yeah.
Rebirth Raven should be, if not already. Like, there's just certain considerations that are... I don't know, it feels like it's obvious to me, and maybe it is, and it's just that other people have finally feeling like they can say it.
Yeah.
Have they been suppressed? Have their voices been censored? I don't know.
Well, I think that's the great thing, is really, like, when you don't like a character in this game, right? Early on, when you first sort of are getting your gold characters, you play who you have, right?
Right.
And you tend to like things that you're familiar with. There reaches a point where every time you get a new character, you're evaluating the characters that you already have.
Right.
And it's different for everybody because you spend a different amount of time playing, right?
Right.
But that point is when you sort of run out of energy, right? On your team. And so if you play it, in long bursts, you have maybe like 3 teams that you might need for like multiplayer to cycle around, or maybe even more if you're doing it faster. I'm trying to think about how fast you get it.
And I guess depending on how long you play. I mean, if you have the cards, I think it's taking more than 8 minutes, almost 9 minutes per bar. Yeah. And so you need 10 bars once you've used them all up. Yeah. In multiplayer, it's 2 each fight. So you won't need the full, because as you're fighting, after the first fight, you're generating power too, right? So we're looking at well over an hour. Yeah. Yeah, no, so there's a certain point where it sort of flips. Instead of playing everybody you have, what you're doing is you're actively pruning down who you play as, right? And when you reach that point, somebody that you don't enjoy, it's not worth putting resources into evolve. It's not worth pulling them through fights to get them more XP, to get them into a position. So you make decisions not super fast, and everybody takes a different amount of speed and sort of time with the characters, right? But you're making decisions about who you want to play with. And so if somebody is not appealing to you, there's no reason to sort of learn to love them, right? Right. And so what I do think that we've seen from this is people sort of having their own little preferences and stuff. And I have also really enjoyed that process too. So I think that's just my perspective on it, which is I'm glad. And I said this last week, which is I think we have more of a reason than most people to play everybody. Yeah. We have more of an external reason. Different people, some people might want to play everybody and learn everybody for like their own intrinsic motivation, but we have an extrinsic motivation to do it. Right. So our next comment comes from Jaguar King 2892. And I think actually there's 2 parts, and I want to talk about both of them. Yeah. But maybe let's keep the first part now and come back to the second part. Really? I think we want to do both. I think we'll forget. Okay, so Jaguar King says New 52 1D is a good S tier contender. She has probably the most damaging special one that is also only 1 hit, which is always great when dealing with Astro Harness. Her stats are great. Her passive makes her very versatile, as she can be used as either utility or main damage dealer. And I'm going to point out one thing that makes her even better. Her special one takes very little in-game time. Mm-hmm. So she's one of the few characters that can, if you've got Claw of Horus on her and Tantu Totem, you can take 3 kicks at the can before the invulnerability wears off to shatter Astro Harness. So a lot of characters, the special one, game time, it takes too long. There's too long an animation. Yeah. So you might get, at most, 2. Yeah. So that makes her even better. So gear shattering. Okay. And then we'll talk about the second part again. I guess this is our way of sneaking in a non-tier list talk. Right. Regarding book adaptations, as someone who has enjoyed a lot of movie/TV shows that strayed from the source material, for example, American Gods, How to Train Your Dragon, Watchmen, and so on, I get the frustration that comes with your favorite book being bastardized by someone who doesn't understand said source material, for example, Game of Thrones. What makes most beloved adaptations great, even if they have made a lot of modifications, is that the creators had a clear understanding of what made the original tick and built something original upon it, consequently developing the central themes and taking them to a different direction. I love the extra focus Laura's character got in the American Gods TV show as opposed to the original. How to Train Your Dragon movie franchise had little to no similarities with the books, but it made my childhood and the, at the time, newly introduced theme of the relationship between man and nature is something I've grown to appreciate more with time. And then there's Game of Thrones that completely destroyed everything that made the books worth your while. There's so much wrong with the show, particularly the last couple of seasons, that I won't even get into. Apologies for the huge rant. Do you have any favorite adaptations that did justice to their predecessors or left you disappointed? I'm going to get to that, but this comment, I love this comment because instead of just asking, it's got the detail, it's got the depth that lets me actually riff on a couple of things. So American Gods, when that first came out, I was following Neil Gaiman on his blog when he was actually blogging about the process of writing the book and getting it published. So I knew about the book before it was published, and he did an event in Toronto for the launch of American Gods. I believe it was at the Lillian H. Smith Library with the Judith Merrill collection, which used to be the Spaced Out Library in the Boys and Girls Club downtown. Yeah. And I got to meet Neil Gaiman when he launched it. And I recently got to go back to the Lillian Smith. They had another event from Martha Wells. I love Martha Wells.
Yeah.
She did some of my favorite fantasies in the 90s. And she's had a career renaissance with Murderbot. If you haven't read Murderbot, you like science fiction, gotta read it. Anyways, that's a reminiscence. And I'm gonna have. I think the point about Game of Thrones is an interesting one because I'll put it differently. I think those guys, what are the names? Benioff and something. They actually have a great understanding of the source material. I feel like they've done the first few seasons of Game of Thrones was absolutely brilliant. It captured a lot of what I loved about the books because they had direct source material. When you talk about last few seasons when they wrapped it up, I think that's where they went off the rails a bit because they didn't have source material. They might, even if they'd had a plot outline, I think George R. R. Martin has come out to say that he's the kind of guy who does. I don't know what the opposite is, but there's two ways to write a story. One way is you go by the seat of your pants. They call it pantsing, where you just put characters in a certain area and let them do their thing.
Yeah.
And that's, I think he said that was his tendency, but that he did something a little different where he was plotting out Game of Thrones, and that's why he ran into a bit of trouble. I might be getting this completely wrong. He ran into a bit of trouble because he was trying to bring the plot together, and he called it the Myronese knot, where he couldn't figure out how to get past a plot point that he'd written himself into because he'd been doing too much pantsing. So if in the sort of to substantiate my point or to back up my point, I think is to look at where the season sort of tanked a little bit. And that was towards the end where there was no source material. So have you seen Three Body Problem?
I've not.
Same guys. Also based on books. A 3-book series by a Chinese writer. I'm not gonna say his name. Maybe I'll put it in the description.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how to pronounce his name. But again, source material. Really interesting book. I don't know whether it's as true to the original story like Game of Thrones seemed like it was. I mean, I'm sure there were differences. I'm not one of those obsessive readers that remembers all the details.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure Game of Thrones, it felt very much like it felt watching it as it did reading it.
Yeah. And for me, it's interesting because I'm sure that there are examples, but right now I'm blanking. Because most of the time, I think I tend to like books better than the stories they're adapted into when it happens, because books can be richer, they can have more stuff going on.
Right.
And there are a lot of, I've heard The Expanse was really good.
It is.
As an adaptation. I know the books were good.
Yeah.
I just haven't watched it. Yeah. And so the thing for me is that I think normally I experience one or the other. I think in recent years I've not been doing nearly as much reading as I would like to, and as I have in the past. So recently, if I've been experiencing an adaptation, it's probably the movie or TV show or whatever, right? And I see a lot of stuff that is adaptations of stuff, like the TV show The Boys, right? The Invincible, right? I know that those are adaptations, and I just haven't seen the originals. And so I think, the one that I can think of is something like The Hunger Games, right? Which I read and watched so long ago that I almost don't think my opinions on either are not valid, but like I'm so distant
not as informed
from them.
Right? Because you're not going to be able to really compare it directly.
They are still technically my opinions, but I don't know if they still are what my opinions would be, right? If I read and watched them again now, I don't know if I would have the same opinion on them at all. So I'm sort of hesitant to say I felt this about The Hunger Games or, whatever, because it was so long ago that if I came back to it now, I might have an entirely different relationship to it.
Oh, I should say first, to answer the injustice part, I agree. New 52 Wonder Woman is absolutely S tier.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a few books. In general, Philip K. Dick, the adaptations, I feel, of every one of his books is better than my experience with the books. So, I mean, and I read a lot of them first, but Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep was not nearly as enjoyable as Blade Runner.
Yeah.
Total Recall, the movie, was wow. It was the original one with Arnold Schwarzenegger was so much fun. And which was one, Man in the High Castle. Again, I struggled with it. It was one of the, Ursula Le Guin actually personally recommended that to me. So I don't know. Did I
book.
told that story? Yeah, she personally recommended it because when I met her one time, she did a talk in an interview and a signing afterwards in Toronto.
Yeah.
Back in the early 90s. And I mentioned to her not only, obviously that I loved her stuff, but that she was the reason I read Gene Wolfe and the Book of the New Sun because of her blurb on it. And so she actually asked me, so have you read Man in High Castle? And I said, I did. I tried it, but I struggled. You really should try that again. It is really good. And yeah, anyways, Ursula Gwynn, she was so great. She was so cool too. And the Man in High Castle adaptation that was on Amazon, so good. So compelling in a way that I struggled with The Man in High Castle. And I read quite a bit. I think clearly there's certain books that you have to be in the right frame of mind to immerse yourself in it. Because I think Philip K. Dick does a lot of like really strange stuff that doesn't let you just sort of slide into it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because like reading is like a skill and a muscle. And there's also, a way to read, right? Like the most obvious is like nonfiction versus fiction, right? But I think fiction does something that like nonfiction and certain types of fiction where understanding it can sometimes be a little besides the point almost. Like I know Catch-22, right? One of the things that they do is that there's a lot of like sort of things that don't make sense almost purposefully. And if you're just reading it at face value, it's supposed to be confusing and messy and whatever. And part of that is the theming of like, there's a lot of stuff in war that doesn't make sense, right? That they're trying to make sense of their existence as soldiers, and a lot of it just doesn't. So there's like I've read a little bit of it and I kind of bounced off of it because it was for school. And so I had to understand it. And that's sort of where that tension came in of a book where a lot of it being sort of confusing on purpose is really frustrating when you have to form opinions and analysis.
See, this is why something like Flowers for Algernon to me is so brilliant, because they tell the story in an unconventional way, and they tell it from the perspective of somebody who is not as able to express themselves. And they do such a brilliant, Daniel Keyes did such a brilliant job of bringing you into the mindset of the character so that you watch the rise and the fall like you're experiencing it.
Yeah. Although I'd have to come back and see how I felt about it reading it again with what I know now, because I think the tragedy of the story being somebody being neurodivergent, or is he supposed to be autistic in the story? I don't know if they make it explicit.
I don't think it's explicit.
But if the tragedy of it is supposed to be a loss of sort of communication ability that he is sort of given and taken away, I think I would need to see how I feel about the way that it portrays sort of neurodivergence.
So it's been a few years since I've read it, but to me, another example of somebody who tells it unconventionally, mainstream, Butcher Boy by Patrick McCabe. But all right, so, and it's good. So my feeling is, from what I remember from reading it, is that the tragedy is what you bring to it.
Yeah.
So Charlie himself doesn't feel that uncomfortable.
Yeah.
He doesn't feel that. He's actually okay. It's what we bring to it and the people around him that feel sorry for him or that take advantage of him and abuse him.
Yeah.
That's where it's the book becomes sort of a conversation between the writer and the reader, where the reader brings their own sort of predetermined or sort of preconceptions, their notions of what they think is good and what's bad.
Fair enough, yeah.
So I think it actually works better than you might remember because it doesn't rely on telling you this is how you should feel. It's by just showing you and opening up the internal life of this character who's gone on this huge roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
And it's your judgment, because I think for a lot of it, Charlie's pretty happy.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you were the one who used the words of like the rise and the fall, right?
Yeah.
You've put sort of like value language on like the process.
Because I brought it, because that's, I think the rise and fall is not so much the joy, but the things that Charlie has and then has taken away. To me, when you have more and it's not a bad thing, like it's a quality, not equality, then I think, you can characterize it without having necessarily the same kind of judgment as to how important it is for maybe the bigger picture of being happy and living a sort of not a satisfactory life, but just sort of having I guess that's it really, just being happy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. Oh, and I'll tell you another thing too. See, here's the one thing that maybe gets overlooked sometimes is that the audience that reads fiction is orders of magnitude smaller than the audience that watches fiction.
Yeah.
So any adaptation, even if it's a bad one, I think,
is going to be much more popular and is going to bring more people from show to book, or TV to book, or movie to book, sorry.
Yeah, I don't worry about a movie and adaptation ruining a book. I'm just happy that the book gets more attention because...
It helps people discover it.
Yeah, because the book is going to be there. So an example of this where I think the movie was not nearly as successful as the book was Jumper by Stephen Gould. So this was around the time, maybe a year before Martha Wells' first book, Element of Fire, came out, and loved Jumper. Absolutely loved it. There's a bunch of sequels out. But the movie was disappointing.
Yeah.
And I didn't mind. I'm just happy that it means that there's more audience, because if I love a book, I want more people to read it so that I can talk to them about it.
A bad movie will still bring a bunch of eyes to a book, but a great movie will like rocket a book. Or like a movie that does well, even if it's not great.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, there's another thing I can't remember now which movie I was going to talk. The Abyss was an interesting thing where it's different. So it was never it wasn't a book first, but the adaptation of the movie was written at the same time as the movie was being produced. And it was written by Orson Scott Card, who unfortunately has turned out to be a real raging bigot. But it was a great, absolutely brilliant movie, The Abyss. And the book was enlightening. It gave everything more depth in a way that didn't take away from the movie. Like you didn't need it to enjoy the movie, but it added more to the movie than I thought was than I expected.
Yeah.
So that was another example of just a different way of doing it, where it wasn't a book becoming a movie, but just two things together that became something bigger and better. The book by itself, I don't think would have been enough because it didn't have the spectacle.
Yeah.
But The Abyss, the movie, and the book together, absolutely brilliant.
So there we go.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we got caught up in talking about books. We have enough comments that I'm not even 100% sure we're going to be able to get through
in this season.
But we'll see. But that is our time. So to finish up, we'd like to give a huge thank you to all of our wonderful patrons on Patreon. That is Michael Devries, Irvin, Ruiz, Hoshi 127, Nora Klimek, and Paolo-Cesar-Pablo-Juan, supporting us on the credited level, as well as 5x5, who support us on the gratitude
wait, hold on.
level.
Did you say Pablo twice?
Paolo-Cesar-Pablo-Juan, yeah.
Isn't it one of those Paulo? I gotta see my notes.
Paolo-Cesar-Pablo-Juan. Sorry. My apologies, Paolo. Anyways, we'd like to thank you so much for your support. We'd like to thank all of you for watching. We'll see you next time.
Komoda.